how it normally works.
Which is fine, because I always say that people are running on poet time, which I'm
Poet time and Zoom time as well.
Hey, we're all wearing black.
I noticed that.
good.
Same wavelengths.
And all different kind of like light situation.
Good job. I'm glad you got that part of my email too, to coordinate the.
I was like, did she really? Did she send an email? No, she didn't send an email. We just ended up wearing black. We ended up wearing all black.
Hi, folks. Thanks for joining us. If you're joining us for our event with Kazim Ali and Layli Long Soldier, you are in the right place. We're going to get started in just a moment. Before we get started, I'd like to first say hi, welcome. I'm Car. I'm a bookseller here at Green Apple Books in San Francisco. And I'm going to tell you about a couple of events that we have coming up in the next week. On Monday, March 22nd at 6 p.m., which will also be light out then, if you can believe that. March is going by so quickly. Kim Adamizio is going to be joining us to celebrate her latest collection of poetry, Now We're Getting Somewhere. I'm a big fan of Kim Adamizio. I'm really glad that the Bay Area gets to have her here. And we do have signed copies of her book available for purchase as well. Do recommend. That will be this coming Monday, March 22nd at 6 p.m. Pacific time. And then on Tuesday, March 23rd at 6 p.m., Chris Collin will be discussing his latest book called Off, The Day the Internet Died. Chris will be joined by the book's illustrator, Renee Shaw, and Daniel Handler as well, friend of the store. Off is essentially a bedtime story for adults about what would happen if the internet forced us to unplug for a day or for forever, and what would we do? So it should be pretty fun. We do have signed copies of Chris's book as well that will be available for purchase, and that is going to be on Tuesday, March 23rd at 6 p.m. We do have a full calendar of our events on our website at greenapplebooks.com, and all of our events are free unless otherwise stated. That being said, I'm not above it. Please do buy books if you can. Please do buy books from us. If you've been here before, you've surely heard me say, when you buy books from us, it supports us as an independent bookstore. It supports the authors that put so much time and so much of their heart into this work, and you get a book out of it, which is maybe the best part. So do consider that. I will say too that on top of carrying books by these two authors that are joining us this evening, we also carry a number of books by Asian and Asian American authors and Asian women. And there's kind of no better time than now to read books by Asian American people. And even if you don't buy them from us, even if you get them from the library or get them by any means necessary, it's important to educate yourself and do this work consistently. And I think that's our job to promote as a bookstore. So it's about reading the work and letting it do that work for you. So keep that in mind. That's my PSA for today and always. Without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our authors for this evening. I'm so glad to be joined by both of the people that we have here this evening. Layli Long Soldier holds a BFA from the Institute of American Indian Arts and an MFA from Bard College. Her poems have appeared in Poetry Magazine, the New York Times, The American Poet, The American Reader, The Kenyon Review, Bomb, and elsewhere. She's the recipient of an NACF National Artist Fellowship, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, a Whiting Award, and was a finalist for the 2017 National Book Award. She also received the 2018 Penn Gene Stein Award and the 2018 National Book Critics Circle Award. She's the author of Promo Samori from Q Avenue Press and Whereas from Grey Wolf Press. She resides in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I'm glad to have her here this evening. Welcome, Layli Long Soldier. And Kazim Ali's books encompass multiple genres, including the award-winning collections Skyward and The Far Mosque, as well as his novel The Secret Room, a string quartet, and the hybrid memoir Silver Road, Essays, Maps, and Calligraphies. He has translated the work of Marguerite Duras, Sora Seperi, and many others, and has taught at various colleges and universities, including Oberlin, St. Mary's College, and Naropa. He is currently a professor of literature at UC San Diego. We had the pleasure of hosting Kazim for his latest poetry collection, The Voice of Sheila Chandra, and if you haven't read it yet, you absolutely should. And his most recent book, Northern Light, Power, Land, and the Memory of Water is the reason we're here this evening. Really glad to have him back. Please join me in welcoming Kazim Ali.
Oh, thank you, Car, and thank you, Green Apple, and thank you, Layli, for being with me in conversation. And thanks all of you for coming too from around the country. It looks like I'm looking at the list of names here, and I can see folks are here from New York, from Virginia, from California, from other places too. I am zooming into you from what's commonly called San Diego, California, situated on the historic and ancient lands of the Kumeyaay people, who actually run Kumeyaay College, the only tribally controlled college in the California community college system. And they're doing great things in terms of their activism against the construction of the border wall and other issues. So I'm grateful to be a guest in their land. This book, I'm going to read a short excerpt from the book, and then Layli and I are going to talk about it. This book, Northern Light, tells the story of a dam in northern Manitoba that was built on, as many of the hydroelectric dams in the northern provinces in Canada, they were built on Indigenous land. And my father, newly immigrated from India, from England, India by way of England, with my mother and my two sisters, we lived up there where my dad was part of the team that was building the dam. It wasn't until many years later, many years later, that I started to really remember that place that I had lived briefly as a child for several years, as a child, 3 or 4 years, and came to learn of a suicide epidemic that had impacted the young people there, and resolved and got back in touch, wrote to the Indigenous community of Cross Lake, to the chief, whose name was Kathy Merrick, the chief at the time, and she invited me to go and visit. And I thought, what am I going to do up there, you know? And so that's the excerpt that I'm going to read to you. I've already made the decision to go back, and now I'm trying to we're planning the trip basically. So it's a short excerpt from the beginning of the book. If you have the book, it's from chapter 2. Chief Kathy Merrick put me in touch with Leroy Muswagon, one of the members of the Executive Council who was responsible for monitoring the implementation of the Northern Flood Agreement, the comprehensive treaty co-signed in 1975 by the provincial government, the federal government of Canada, Manitoba Hydro, and the 5 Northern First Nations communities that would be affected by the building of the dam, including the Pimicikamak. The Pimicikamak, that's their own language name for what is translated as Cross Lake. I gave Leroy a call. So, you want to come back to Cross Lake, he asked me, sounding a little skeptical, I thought. Well, I'm not sure if back is right, because in all the years I was growing up in Genpeg, I never actually came to Cross Lake. Is that right? He asked slowly. He sounded distracted to me, as if he was engaged in another task while speaking to me. I started getting a little nervous. Well, you know, my mom and her friends used to drive over the lake in winter to shop, buy moccasins and gloves and that kind of thing. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Leroy was shifting papers around, saying something to someone. So why do you want to come back now? He asked. I wasn't sure if his apparent wariness was because he didn't trust me or because Chief Merrick hadn't filled him in on all of the details. Well, I grew up in Genpeg, I said. My father was one of the engineers on the dam, but I never really knew what happened there. I want to see for myself the environmental damage and learn about the social and economic impact of the dam on Cross Lake. Leroy was silent. I took it not as skepticism, but rather a conversational pattern I would come to know better in the coming weeks. Silence as an invitation, silence as interest. Well, I said then, awkwardly trying to make a connection. I visited Israel. I've been to the West Bank. I spent a lot of time learning about the issues that face Palestinian people who live in the countryside and the villages, the ways the occupation has impacted them in their daily lives and impacted their families. Is that right? Leroy asked again. Buoyed by what I perceived as more interest in his tone, I continued. Well, for example, their traditional agricultural techniques rely on desert sustainable water practices, but most of the Israeli settlements in the West Bank are placed directly on top of the freshwater aquifers, which they pipe back into treatment centers in Israel. So the Palestinians have to buy back the water and their allotment is not always sufficient. Leroy was silent, not uninterested, I decided, listening. I want to visit Genpeg, I blurted out. I mean, the old town site, yeah, but I need to know about Cross Lake as well. I don't think I can understand my childhood until I know what happened in your community. I wasn't sure if I was explaining myself well enough. The truth is, I'm not sure if I myself knew the reasons for my trip well enough to explain them to him. All right, said Leroy then, perhaps convinced by my clumsy entree. Can you come on Saturday evening instead? I want to invite you to take part in a sweat lodge ceremony. After you go through that, we'll show you everything there is to show you here and answer all your questions. A sweat lodge, I asked, a little surprised. It's one of our most sacred ceremonies, he said. We want to make sure that you know this is not about political power or money for us. It's about the soil, the rocks, the river. They are our mother, and our life doesn't feel right without her. We want to share with you something of what we are first. Then we can talk to you about the treaties and the dam. I hung up with Leroy, newly uneasy. What was I getting myself into? I had had some strange nostalgic idea about going back to the town of my childhood, trooping through the forest on whatever access road I could find, and then maybe writing some remembrance about the trees and the water. And now I had agreed to be a part of some kind of ceremony in a community I barely knew. And would I be going there as a poet or as a journalist, an ethnographer or scholar or memoirist, or just a lonely person who wanted to look at a place he once thought of as home? I was acutely aware that each of those roles had its own array of ethical considerations, and I felt prepared for none of them. I'm going to skip ahead here. Just before leaving for Manitoba, I went to a poetry festival in Salem, Massachusetts. I spent 3 days there among poets and writers, understanding who I was and what I was supposed to do. I remembered a time 20 years earlier when I'd been at the Dodge Poetry Festival in New Jersey. I was attending a panel on the responsibility of poets to engage in political affairs. The 3 poets on the panel were Yusuf Komunyakaa, Anne Waldman, and Nellie Wong. Komunyakaa claimed that artists ought to have no political agenda or goal in their work, but bring all of their sensibilities to bear on the writing. Wong expressed the view that political and social realities come first, before art. And in her case, the organizing and political actions she was involved in became the subjects of her work. And Waldman said what I thought to be the most interesting thing, which was that artistic practice itself is political action. She argued that the making of art could affect real and lasting social change in the lived world. The thought comforts and unsettles at once. 20 years later, on the last day of the festival in Salem, I stopped at one of the tables in the book fair where a young woman was folding tiny origami cranes. She aimed to fold 1,000 of them throughout the festival. She invited people to sit with her at the table and learn how to fold cranes. These were then collected in trays for people to take home. I chose an orange crane and put it in the pocket of my jacket. That night at the hotel, I called my friend, Layli Long Soldier, and told her about my upcoming trip to Cross Lake. Layli is like me, somewhat of a wanderer, having been raised in the Southwest, living in the Phoenix Valley as a child, in the Four Corners area as a teen, and then on the Navajo Nation and in Santa Fe, where she lives now. She also has family on the Lakota Reservation, where she often visits. Layli's book of poetry, Whereas, played a huge role in how I understand the actively moving parts of Indigenous language and experience on the North American continent. Her work tries to excavate sediments of hidden history, language, and politics, and I felt a sense of kinship with her as I wondered to myself, what would I discover in Cross Lake? I needed to talk to her. I'm not going to try to do Layli's voice. Too much pressure. Kazim, she exclaimed, when I explained to her what was going on, that I was leaving for Manitoba the next morning. I never knew this about your childhood, she said, that you grew up on the res. I laughed. I never knew I grew up on the res either. Nobody told us we were on Indigenous land. And I didn't know anything about Cross Lake, except that's where the other kind of Indians lived. That's always the secret, said Layli, whose land you were on, what happened there before. In fact, I said, when we were little, we didn't even think about the people in Cross Lake, really. I mean, I kind of vaguely remember people saying things about them, not really kind, very stereotypical stuff. Layli was silent. Am I betraying my father somehow by going? I blurted out. Even though, honestly, I'm sure he had no idea about what might happen because of the environmental impact of the dam. How was he supposed to know? And who knew the province was going to screw up all the treaty promises? I think you're honoring him by going, Layli said. You're going to represent him and maybe help remediate in some small way. Do you think? I said. I don't know. What can I really do? Write about it? How is that going to matter? Who's going to read what a poet has to say? Well, she said, matter-of-factly, you can't avoid it anymore. You opened the door. Why are you really nervous? Do you think the people there are mad at me or my father? I ask. She says, they wouldn't ask you to sweat if that were the case. Well, maybe that's what I'm wondering about. What are they expecting of me? I mean, I'm going up there and I'm going to go through this sweat lodge. Are they trying to purify me or something? That isn't how it works, Layli said. Our spirituality is not transactional. It's an invitation to you to share in their life. They're welcoming you as family. They're inviting you into their community and their sacred space. There are no strings attached to that from their side because they believe in the powers of the ceremony itself. But don't go in if you aren't willing to be changed. I wasn't sure. If anything, I felt apprehensive. My father is one of the men who built that dam that led to so many broken promises, to such economic, social, and environmental disaster. How could I account for that? People have been connected to the land for thousands and thousands of years, Layli continued. To be cut off from it is not a small thing, but Kazim, honestly, when you think about it, how few years has it really been since the Europeans came to this continent and changed things so much? We are only at the chronological beginning of the trauma. There's still time to work against the disconnect, to reconcile with both land and people. I think that's why they invited you. Inviting you to the sweat lodge was a gesture of generosity. They're asking for your service, not just to report on them or to be a passive witness. But that's the part I wonder about. I say, what can I do in the end? Well, what started you on all this in the first place? Layli asked, changing the subject. So you were looking for information on your hometown. You found out about the dam's impact, but then why get so fixated? It was the rash of suicides, I replied. I couldn't believe it when I read about it. It happened last year, 7 suicides in 1 month, and then 25 more attempted suicides at a high school with 500 students. Can you imagine? The council called a state of emergency. The elders performed some ceremony. Layli cut me off. Wait, what? In the spring, I said, last March, the elders, they declared a state of emergency and performed this ceremony, calling the spirits of the land and the water and the sky to come and help the young people in the community. Oh, Kazim, she said, her voice dropping, and I couldn't tell if she was kidding or not. They called you. From Boston, I will fly to Minneapolis and then on to Winnipeg, where I will catch a 12-seat propeller plane that will carry me into the boreal forests of northern Manitoba. In my pocket, I have my plane ticket, a passport, and the origami crane. As I hand my ticket to the agent, I reach with my other hand into my pocket and hold the crane between my thumb and forefinger. The artist was following an old tradition of folding 1,000 cranes to promote peace. I took one as a talisman for my journey back into history. I am worried. Not worried because it holds any danger for me, but worried because of everything that has happened in the 40 years since. I imagine the crane's energy accompanying me on this journey, once more crossing a border, this time into my past. Thank you.
I feel I had to unmute. I didn't I want you to hear applause.
Thank you. Thank you. So you're a guest star in this book.
I know. I am so, like, I'm, first of all, Kazim, I'm honored that you would include me as part of the book, but I'm also very shy, like hearing that, it's kind of like hearing, seeing a video of yourself or hearing a recording of your voice. This is like, oh.
Well, I want to tell everybody, I did send this chapter to Layli and
Yeah.
she sent it back with this. She was like, no, don't say that. Cut that part out. I don't want, don't say that part. So it's like, it's a version of what the full conversation was. Yeah.
Well, where should we begin?
I mean, I'm really, of course, very curious to know how, you and I have been on a journey together. I think that's what most our friends who are in the audience here don't know. I mean, I met you through your work. Of course, I heard you read. And then since that time, we've been having this sort of ongoing conversation, and you really, really started me thinking about language and history and sediments. And I know that I was haunted, maybe truly haunted by those spirits to start going into my past. But the truth of the matter is that our conversation started me thinking about it a long time before. Whose land I was living on, what happened there, what was the history of it, what were the languages that were spoken in those places. And for someone like me, who's, really a nomad, who's lived in many different places in my life, and 2 generations back in my family, we're scattered across the world, right? Like my parents were both born in India, a place I no longer have access to because my father's family moved to Pakistan. And so I'm governed by these new weird visa rules. So, it's like, I don't have a place. And I think that in 2016, when all this happened and this president came in, I felt like, God, I'm not even really American. I can't even hold on to that. I'm not included here either. I don't belong anywhere, and that really started me thinking about what does it mean to be from a place? How do we get to claim that? What does that afford us? What rights does it afford us to be from a place? What if you are from nowhere? Or you don't have the right kind of papers? You're just denied, you're lost, you're nobody? I just am haunted by these questions. And I think that's all of that also was so swirling around in the air as I did that weird, impossible thing when the chief told me, when she invited me to come back. I just thought, like, what do you mean go back? I mean, this was 40 years later, more than that, even 42 years later since we moved from that place. I just, it was just a very strange, feeling like Alice going down into Wonderland or something like that. And yet it was very real when I got there.
Right. I have a few things to say on this that you're making me think about. But before I say any of that, do you have a guest?
Yeah,
Hello.
Marco's sneaking in.
Marco.
Marco's coming to listen in. Yeah.
Oh, good to see you.
Yeah.
Layli, always lovely to see you.
Before I say anything further, before I go into that, I do have to say, Kazim, I love your haircut so much. I have to comment on it because yes, I saw you turn to, I was like, oh my God. So beautiful.
There's a lot of different looks that can be created. Yeah. Oh no, we're live. Marco's like, are you guys live? You're just chatting. No,
Yeah.
we're live.
We're talking about hair.
Yeah.
Okay. But because we have other people here with us, I do want to be thoughtful and mindful of that, and maybe share some of the things that the book makes me think about, and also what you just said about some of our conversations and so forth. I want to, and maybe this is not like completely thought out, but it's something that we can maybe think about together. I think what I really appreciated, number one, was like you said, these sort of questions that were circling. You had these questions that continue to come out and to surface throughout the book about belonging, about land, place, and so on. Like there, I don't remember what page it's on, but you asked this question about what does it mean to belong to a land, or to belong to a land. And I will get to that in a minute, but that really, for some reason, really stuck with me. I think maybe coming from my perspective, and I would love to talk about that more with you. But I also wanted to thank you for this work, because it made me think about an event that I was at once. I was asked to have a conversation, a public conversation with a writer that I really, really admire, still admire greatly. But anyway, it was on the East Coast. It was in New York, and we had our public our dialogue, and afterwards there was a Q&A. And I can't remember the exact question, but someone stood up in the audience and asked me something about whiteness and how I deal with whiteness when I encounter it, right? Or something like that. I'm completely paraphrasing, but it was something on that subject. And so my response was, and I still feel the same, was, whiteness isn't, from my standpoint, it's not always the first and foremost concern as I engage with the world around me, like uh, from Native perspective. I said, a lot of times I think more in terms of nation to nation. We are nations within this nation, and we are people of our own, with a particular rights and a particular sovereignty and governance, language, history, philosophies that are right here in front of everyone, and yet completely, invisible. But amongst Native people, amongst First Nations people, we recognize each other as in our distinction and in our, as peoples, right? As with those nations. And I think nation isn't, you actually addressed some of this too in your book, which is great. The idea of nationhood, I think, is also very recent and very political term to use. Okay, I'm just going to use it right now loosely, but I really did appreciate what you had to say about that too. But so in that public conversation that we had on the East Coast, going back to that, I got the sense that later on in the conversation, in the Q&A, that people felt like I was sidestepping the issue of whiteness. And it was really like I left the event feeling a little disappointed, like I didn't feel understood, first of all. And I also felt like maybe there was more to be understood that people just they don't have the frame of reference to understand, And so what I meant is, basically for Native people, in encountering the world around us, it's not just white people that don't know what they're saying or doing or where the land that they're living on. It is people of just about every background. And they are here because of treaties and agreements. And this affects everyone on this land, not just white people, right? So,
Yeah.
and that I can go into classrooms. Sometimes I do this too. I know it might be kind of sneaky or underhanded, but sometimes when I'm invited places, before I go, I will research who the Native communities are around a particular university. And that'll be one of my first questions to the students. I'll ask them, can you tell me within 100-mile radius, what are the Native communities, who lives here in this area? And I'm telling you, I have gone literally to really well-respected universities. I'm thinking of one in particular, and this whole classroom, not one student can answer me. Not one student knew any of the Native communities, and yet they were sitting there talking to me about decolonization. And those students were of various backgrounds. So this is the point I'm making, and why it is so significant and so meaningful to me, Kazim, that you would go. And it is not the trip you made, the journey you made was physical. I mean, it is to embody that experience, because these are not things, I think maybe our ways and our histories and so forth. It's one thing to have it up here, to understand it cerebrally, right? But to go and to eat with people and to, see their ice rink like you did, that it's run down, and yet they're doing their best. They're making the best out of what they have, right? To have a Mother's Day brunch and all the moms there, and the lady with, I'm assuming it was a ribbon skirt. I don't know what kind of skirts you were describing, but I'm thinking they were ribbon skirts. and the lady take her skirt off and there's sweatpants underneath, all of those details, to be there and to feel it and see it, that's important. It's so important. And you continually ask, why am I here? What am I doing here? Why did I come here? And I really do think it was that book. It is this book. That is why you came. And I do feel it's very important work, a very important contribution to this place that you live in. And I include Canada. I think Canada and US, there's really not much of a border, to be quite honest. We share as Native people, Indigenous people, we share, the histories are so similar. There's the borders, yeah.
I do want to say one thing about that, which is that when I was there and I was going through all of the different experiences that I write about, and I was writing like mad. I have this notebook. I still have it. It's up on the shelf over there. And I would be talking to people and looking at them in the eyes while talking to them and just writing, like the whole time writing. And I didn't know what I was doing. And so a bunch of people, I got introduced at one of the meetings, I got introduced as a journalist. And I was sort of like, oh, I'm not a journalist, tried to correct them. The second time it happened, I didn't correct them. But at one point I meet one of the young women who's in the teacher training program. This is towards the end of the book. Her name is Maria Misswagen. And she asks me, are you writing a book? And I say, I don't know, maybe, I'm not really sure. And she said to me, and this is in the book, she says back, I might write a book. I might have some questions for you. She said, I might have some questions for you. I'm thinking of writing a book. Mm-hmm. And I said to her, you absolutely should write a book. And here's my business card and you can, get, and we've stayed in touch since then. She has a lot going on. She's doing her, she's in college, she's doing her teacher training and she's doing her student teaching. But I still hold out this weird nugget somewhere in my heart that is like, I wrote this book about that dam and about that community, but the true happiness will come to me when someone from that community writes their own story about all of this, So I'm kind of like biding my time, but also I've been talking to the principal of the high school actually to try to maybe make a connection and see if we can do some kind of writing project, or we're in the discussion stage right now, but I don't imagine this book as the end of anything. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In other words,
sure, it's not the end of anything. It's not the only perspective,
and not to be the definitive story or anything.
Sure.
Yeah.
But it's important to make that contribution. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was like, we as immigrants, my family, we came to Canada from England and India before that, and we wanted to be a part of the new country, and I think there was always a part of me, and even my father, I think truly was like proud of like this major thing that he'd been involved with. It provides hydroelectric power to most of the province of Manitoba, some Northern American city, the state of Minnesota and the city of Minneapolis. They also get power from this dam. Like, I think we thought about it in a certain way, like that we were then, as immigrants, we were sort of plugged into the national story, and we didn't have the consciousness at that time that there were Indigenous people on the other side of that national story of Canada that couldn't get in, or didn't want they wanted their own sovereignty and their own rights and all of that to be upheld. And so there was kind of two stories happening at once. One was me, hoping to find my home, to find a place that I felt like I could belong to, and then realizing that space was never mine. It was never Canada. It was always something else. It always belonged to other people. And then that story that came to be told. So I think there is a tension that goes throughout the book between wanting to belong and knowing that desire to belong to that space is itself, it's compromised in some way. It's compromised by the power relationship that brought me there, which was the province was going to build a dam. on this river that runs through these traditional lands.
Yeah, I think that there's a line, I wish that I had it marked in the book, but there's a line in there somewhere where you say that there was a price paid
Yeah.
for, for the building and the operation of that dam, but it was not paid by the people who were there.
Yeah. That was my real, this page 121.
Yeah.
Yeah,
How did
my childhood, those game-filled days and star-filled nights came at a high cost, but it wasn't one that I paid.
Yes.
Yeah.
It makes me think again, also, sorry, I miss anecdote. I'm the anecdote queen.
I like the anecdotes.
My way of moving in the world. But anyway, it reminds me of one time also a reading that I had a reading, okay? And then after the reading, I had some friends there and we were all gonna go eat. And so we went to a restaurant together and they were friends of various backgrounds. And so when we were sitting together at the table, some people were commenting on the work that I read. It was a piece, it was like around the time of Standing Rock. And actually, when I read the piece, I started to cry because that was a very emotional time. This was before Trump came into office, right before November 2016, at the height of the violence and the worry that everyone had and so on. So I read this piece and I cried. And then one of my friends at the table said, I've been sitting here and I haven't really known what to say about your reading. I've been quiet. And he said, I guess I've been quiet because I feel guilty. And and my friend is actually, their family is not, is immigrant family. I think first generation, my friend is first generation to be born here. And so, and that made me so sad. I was like, to share this, to share these stories certainly is not about guilt. And that's actually why I wanted to share that video by Faith Spotted Eagle, because Faith Spotted Eagle, who is at Standing Rock and is also a huge advocate for land, our land rights and treaty rights and so forth. She talks about that and she says, to share these stories, like let's say as Native people, this is important to our healing, to be able to be heard. But it is not about guilt. It's not about shame. Guilt and shame are not necessarily things that lead to health or,
Yeah.
But it is important for other people to be able to hear and to listen. Again, it's not about guilt, but it is about freedom, as in her words, freedom or liberation from denial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I love hearing that from you because the part that I read tonight was about, me feeling worried or wondering what was going to happen. But as soon as I got there, as soon as I started meeting people, as soon as I started hearing the stories, I mean, yeah. I mean, the first night I do go into the Sweat Lodge and that was a very powerful experience in and of itself. But I realized that there was no real time for all of that. it was more like, I got to be present. As long as I'm attached to my guilt or shame about like whatever we did, it's a way of not being in the present moment. I'm still stuck in the past of whatever happened, and I'm still centering my own experience.
Right.
It's like, you know what? The elder, the Jackson Osborne, he's one of the elders I met. That's his arm, his hand holding up a photograph on the cover. He just started talking to me a mile a minute. He wanted to pack info into me. You know, he wanted me to know everything. And I was
Yes.
like, I don't have time to feel guilty. I got to pay attention. I got to make sure I write all this down, you know? So I don't even know if I reckoned with it in any way that would sound interesting to anybody. It just sort of shunted itself away. It just disappeared. It's like,
Yes.
okay, am I going to be in the present moment now? Am I going to be with this community now? What happened 47 years ago happened. You know, what's next? What's my part in what's next? And that's where everything just focused.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Kazim, I wonder, should we be answering questions from other
Yeah.
folks?
Yeah,
What is
I
that?
don't know. Is there a chat? No, there's the Q&A. So people can go into the Q&A and put questions in. There is a question here. Do you feel you are still assimilated, or that you are pulling away from westernized mindsets? I'm not really sure how to answer that. I mean, I don't think I assimilated super well to begin with as like a brown queer Muslim. I feel on the outside of a lot of different things, but without a doubt, I was inside the national narrative at that time as a child, you know, with a father who worked for Manitoba Hydro, and now as a grown, you know, person, you know, living on occupied, still on unceded occupied land now, teaching at the University of California. I mean, I think that I can have my own personal, you know, attitudes, and what Layli said about like, we can talk about decolonization all we want, but like, as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang famously wrote, you know, their seminal essay, decolonization is not a metaphor, that it shouldn't just, you know, it shouldn't be like a stand-in for something else. If you're going to decolonize it, that's like a very serious, real, powerful thing. So, I mean, I think I'm still in process. I'm still learning. I moved to San Diego in March, in early 2019, and then lockdown happened, you know, a year later. So I had really a year here to engage, and I went down into a few of the events that the Kumeyaay community, including the political actions that they were doing, and met a few people, but I've not really become, you know, engaged in the community to the extent that I think one ought to be. And I'm hoping that, you know, that's one of my, you know, commitments for the future, basically. But I don't know. I'm not sure. I think that, you know, one of the conversations, Layli, that you and I had in the past was about, you know, artistic and literary traditions. And as a writer, in America, you know, you are able to draw from whatever the indigenous traditions are, but you also draw from Gertrude Stein, and you draw from English modernism, and like all of these different things, like that we, you know, that we have access to all of those things as people in the modern and the postmodern world. That it's not such a question of like what's westernized or not westernized, but what feels, you know, authentic personally, aesthetically, and politically, I suppose.
I think for me, it's not about what's, you know, westernized or not well, no. I mean, I still take greater interest often in you know, our own culture and traditions, because I'm always learning. So there is still a difference, but I think it's a matter of not having the hierarchy of Western versus, let's say, indigenous or native, and that hierarchy that once was so strong, you know, that this is the standard and everything is below, you know. So no, we don't do that anymore. We learn from different sources in different places, and we decide for ourselves as artists how to apply those things that we learn from everyone. But yeah.
Suman Chabra asked a question in here. Do you have daily practices to engage with the land and elements of nature? I mean, this place is so not dominant, that's the bad word, but like water situated. There's almost more water than land there. And I found myself really, and of course the great irony or tragedy is that the river has now been dammed, but I really found myself so attached to that place, not just from memory, but from experience of being there while I was writing. So then later when I was revising the book, doing the second revision, I actually went back I just holed up in a hotel. I did go out a little bit and visit people, but I was working on the book and then taking these walks around and going to the water. And that crane that I describe in the book, like it stays with me throughout the whole time. But then I do a little ritual with it. I'm not going to spoil it for you. It's in the book. I want you to read it. But I found as I was revising the book back here in California, so haunted, because what happened when I came back was the bulk of what I was doing was all the research-based stuff. So this book is really a blend of history, journalism, and memoir. And the part that I wrote when I was there was what was happening, right? The journalistic part. But when I came back, I was writing all the memories and my childhood and all of the musings about belonging and that kind of stuff. And that was one component of what I wrote when I came back. And the other component of what I wrote when I came back was the historical stuff. And it's important because we don't know the Canadian context. We don't know the Canadian context here in the United States, but a lot of people in Canada don't know the Canadian context. They don't know what the numbered treaties are. They don't know, for example, that what Canadian Child Protective Services with so-called 60s scoop, where they were literally taking children. And this was not in the 19th century. This was in all the way up to 1986, this was happening, where Indigenous children were taken from the families under flimsy pretext, and then given to white Canadian families to adopt. Like all of this stuff, it had to be in there because I was trying to also talk about this mental health crisis in the community. So there's quite a lot that was historical background. So I was writing my own personal stuff, and then I was doing this, and it's very traumatic history. The residential school system in Canada, the Canadian medical doctors, they were doing medical testing and experiments, nutrition experiments on the children. They would do something like they'd say, these 5 kids are not going to get any thiamine. They're going to get everything else. They're not going to get that. And we're going to see what happens. They were doing this stuff during the Nuremberg trials. So there's like this global event of significance happening. Basically, what you now think of as modern medical ethics came out of the Nuremberg trials, like what doctors are and are not allowed to do. That's happening. And while that is happening in this westernized liberal country, these doctors are doing these medical experiments on children. So this kind of stuff lately, when I was researching it, it was traumatizing. I would have to get up and pace around the house, and I would do some yoga, or it was an incredibly challenging, difficult subject matter to then also have to write in some objective way, like I'm trying to give you historical background.
Yeah, I wanted to say a couple things about that. I wanted to actually say that was the one place I was looking for it earlier today, because I remembered it was at the end of a page. I got to the end of a paragraph where you started into the boarding school, some of the boarding school stuff. It was at the end of the page, and I started crying. And it was after also a buildup. You have provided quite a bit more context historically with the taking of land and so on and so on. So it's building up. And I think when you got to the boarding school, I just cried because I let it all out because so first of all, for people listening, there are some really powerful moments in the book that I think are so important to everyone. But I think also for me, Kazim, it's like, excuse me if I get emotional. Excuse me. These are those are very real things. Excuse me for being to everyone. I'm so sorry for getting emotional, but those are very real things that have impacted our families. Like even my own father went to boarding school, K through 12. And we can say, oh, that's, it's of the past. Like, we should just, why do you always dig up the past? It is not of the past.
Not the past.
How my father, you cannot understand the impact, the psychological and emotional impact it had on a whole generation of our communities. My father, my aunties and uncles, like how it affected them and how they relate to others, how they related to their children, me and my siblings. And let me tell you how that has affected me. Even at this age, it's like the onion peeling it back. People say, I have heard this my whole life. People say, you're so aloof. I've heard that word so many times to describe me. And I have really thought about it over the years. And it's like to contain all of these things, to contain that history. And, many of the things that you describe in your book, even though it's in Canada, it's very similar to here. And we have to still move forward. And we have to raise our children or participate in, mainstream, institutions, academia, and be patient and understand that people don't always have the context for understanding us and understanding where they are here on this land,
Yeah.
So, I do appreciate that because I saw that in your book. Like you said, there is all the experience of being in GenPeg and Cross Lake, but I could see also that you put a lot of time into my goodness, the treaties, the law, legislation, and the history there. So it was very moving for me, Kazim. I really appreciate it. And I'm sorry to everyone for crying. I do that all the time, actually.
I appreciate first of all, I appreciate you so much. And I don't want you to feel, I feel like you shared yourself with us in a really deep, beautiful way. It's not the past, it's ongoing. One of the journalists who I write about, Tanya Talaga, she draws a direct connection between the experiences of the residential school system and the suicide epidemics.
Yes.
And Cross Lake is only one of many Indigenous communities where there were suicide epidemics in recent years. Thunder Bay is another, and there is a crisis among the young people in the northern communities in Canada. And the Western doctors now, like recently, they just did the study where they're like, oh yeah, trauma is generational. Physical trauma can be coded into the DNA. And it's like every person of color was like, okay, this is news, and it is present tense. One of the men, one of the elders I meet, his family was in the residential school system. His aunt was sent for medical testing, one of the women elders I meet was in the 60s scoop. She was taken away from her family and she was raised by a white family off the reserve. And she discovered her family when she was maybe 14 or 15. She came back to the reserve and decided to stay with them, So it's all in the present tense, And you know, what you talked about, acknowledgement and reconciliation, like you have to name it. You have to name that damage, that manifestation of those ghosts, those old ghosts that people think are dead. They actually live and walk and are still unfolding their damage amongst, you know, all of us.
Yes.
Yeah.
We,
I love you so much, Layli.
I love you too. And what I want to, I know we're at time, but I don't want to end on the note of damage and trauma.
No.
What I also want to know is one of the greatest, most joyful, the places in the book that felt the brightest and the most joyful was the young students in the classrooms that you went to, where they are learning their language, their culture, their history, their politics are all reinforced. I can't remember the name of the course. Was it First Nations something?
First Nation Studies. First
Nation Studies, and this classroom where the young people felt so comfortable that they came in and sat at the back just to do their homework inside that space, because they felt that is a place that understands them. You know, and I mean, that gave me hope too. You know, all of the language, the revitalization and so forth happening there, and it's happening here too, you know, all over the US. And so I do think things are changing, and I do feel like many people are contributing to this conversation. You know, it's not just Native people sort of screaming into the wind, but we have friends like you and so on. Yeah.
This community is really resilient. They're so powerful. They have plans. They know what they need to do. You know, they're making it happen. In this book, I talk about that one meeting where the elders at the community stand up and say, like, we should be going into the schools. We can teach the traditional arts. We can like that. And then when I went back for my second visit a year later, which I don't describe in the book, but that's when I went back to revise, I went to visit the schools, and I actually taught a few of the classes and stuff. But that program has started. So the elders will come in, they'll check in the morning. They will go and meet with the young people. They teach beading and craft, you know, the different traditional crafts, and they get the little stipend from the government for doing it. And the young people then are getting exposed to, and the young people are now learning Cree, and so then they have the old folks to kind of have Cree conversation time with and everything. So the community knows what to do. They're doing it. They need material resources and buy-in from the province and from the government of Canada. They need support, you know? So, you know, yeah, they're remarkable people.
That's cool. And that's cool to know, Kazim, that you went back.
I was going to go back again because they have in the summer, they have what they call Indian days, like festivals. And then in the winter, they have a dog mushing festival where people come from all around the pole, like Finland, Russia, Iceland, Greenland. They all come down to northern Manitoba, and they do, because the reason why is like it's really flat there, but there's a lot of snow, so they can do these long. So I was going to go back, but then Corona came, so I couldn't go back. But we'll see. I hope that, you know, someday soon
I'm sure you will.
I'll be up there.
Yeah.
Do you want to go with me?
I do. We want to go.
Yeah, I want to. I do. I actually truly I want to take people.
I would love that.
Yeah.
I would like to thank you both so much. I'm sorry to crash your call. Kazim, you handled the Q&A with such aplomb, and you see that the people left very, very nice notes in the Q&A for you, to say thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing your time and connecting with us all here. It's a true gift to have you both joining us, and I'm very grateful. And this book is a whole experience, and I'm really glad that we got to hear you talk about it. Kazim, thank you for joining us. Layli, thank you for joining us. And I'll just show the people this beautiful book that we have here once more before we say goodnight.
And they can order it from you, from Green Apple.
They most certainly can. Thank you all, and thank you for continuing to leave nice notes in the
I want to read some of those notes.
Oh, please do.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really appreciate it. Yeah, old and new friends I see. Thank you, Suman, for your question, and Erica, thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you all. Have a good night. Be well.
And thank you, Layli.
Oh, thank you, Kazim. It's so good to see your beautiful face and your stylish haircut. Yeah. Beautiful. I'm inspired. I feel like I need to up my game now, you know.
I mean, this is probably the haircut you had in 1992 or 3, right?
Probably.
Close to it when you were a punk rocker.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna say good night. Thank you.
All right. Let's talk
you.
soon, Layli. I'd love to catch up. Yeah.
Bye, all. Thank you.
Bye. Bye, everybody.